Welcome to the lesson on the fascinating phenomenon of recomposition. So, recomposition is the simultaneous lean mass gain and fat mass loss. And before we get into the details of that, let's first talk about what's acceptable in terms of body fat gain while gaining muscle. So, what's realistic and acceptable is a muscle to fat gain ratio of 2 to 1 and all the way up to 1 to 1. So the less fat you gain while you gain muscle, the more ideal. However, it is just not realistic to have purely lean gains for certain populations, especially in individuals who are highly trained and are closer to their potential for muscular size than the average beginner or even the average intermediate. And so gaining fat while gaining muscle is often a reality, but the amount of it that is acceptable to gain is somewhere between a 2 to 1 to 1 to 1 ratio of muscle to fat. So when we talk about recomposition, or recomp as we call it in the community, there is a hierarchy of who experiences the greatest magnitude to the lowest magnitude of recomp. And the people who are the recomp champs are formerly fit but currently deconditioned individuals with excess body fat. So people who are formerly fit, ex-athletes, ex-fitness people, those type of folks, they already have the pre-existing infrastructure to carry the muscular rebound, and they already have the training experience. So they've got the neural circuits in place to re-engage the training process. And they may have the, if I can get as micro as this, they may have the superior myonuclear domains compared to untrained folks. And so therefore, or never trained folks. So therefore, formerly fit, deconditioned individuals can experience the greatest recomp, especially if they've let themselves go for a number of years or decades and gained a substantial amount of excess fat. And it's these folks who you typically see waving around these spectacular transformations on social media. They're essentially just bouncing back to where they once were at some point in the past. So in second place are your overweight or overfat beginners. They can experience substantial recomp. And then in third place, intermediate level trainees with excess body fat. These folks can still experience a certain amount of recomp, but nothing particularly spectacular. And then people who are more advanced, people who are close to their potential for muscular size and or leanness, really could do themselves a favor by focusing on one goal at a time instead of purposely trying to achieve recomposition, or this simultaneous gain in lean mass and loss in fat mass. So that right there is the hierarchy of recomp capacity. So what are the common threads, programming wise, that bias the results towards recomposition? And by the way, this is a really great narrative review by my friend and colleague Chris Barakat, and that's available in full text in the references at the bottom there. So he reviewed the literature where recomp was seen, and he specifically picked studies that involved intermediate trainees because it was interesting in the first place to see that recomposition occurred in resistance trained subjects. So overall, the subjects engage in resistance training at least 3 times a week. So the take home there is that you're probably not going to experience substantial recomp if you're engaging a minimal effective dose type of resistance training program. There has to be a certain amount of volume involved. And in this case, at least 3 resistance training sessions per week. And tracking the rate of progress and paying attention to performance and recovery, or just kind of being objective and meticulous. That is one of the other common threads in studies that witnessed recomp. And of course, this is a big one. Consuming an extraordinarily high protein amount. And so we're talking 1.2 to 1.6 grams per pound of fat-free mass. So this was, in terms of total body weight, it would probably be more like about 1 to 1.3-ish grams per pound of total body weight. But Barakat et al.'s findings boiled it down to that value. And this much higher protein than usual intake resulted in recomposition. It's one of the common threads, or one of the most consistent common threads in the recomposition phenomenon. Protein supplements were used in the majority of the studies that saw recomp. Well, naturally, they're trying to boost protein up to a particularly high level. And finally, prioritizing sleep quality and quantity. That could have had a significant effect on making recomp possible. Because when you think about it, when you optimize sleep, you optimize your energy and the amount of effort that you can put into your training. And with sufficient sleep, you do not have dysregulated appetite, whereas somebody lacking sleep would have a lack of energy to put into training bouts, and also a dysregulated appetite where they are craving and giving into cravings and potentially sabotaging the goal of losing fat and or gaining muscle. So here is a specific example of recomp in a randomized controlled trial by Antonio et al. So this involved healthy resistance trained men and women. It was an 8-week study, and it compared a normal protein intake with a high protein intake. So 2.3 versus 3.4 grams per kilogram of body weight per day during this trial. The daily protein intakes of the normal and high protein groups in absolute terms were 167 and 255 grams, respectively. And here's what happened. Fat mass decrease was significant in the high protein group, but not in the normal protein group. And lean mass increased similarly, but not to a significant degree in both groups. So this, when I say significant, I'm talking about statistical significance. So there was a small absolute gain in lean mass, but it just did not reach statistical significance. What did reach statistical significance was the fat mass decrease in the high protein group, which is very interesting. So I want to quote the authors directly because they're driving home a couple of important points. This study, as well as previous work from our lab, suggests that gains in body fat are unlikely to occur with protein overfeeding. Furthermore, gains in fat-free mass can indeed occur in trained subjects with no harmful side effects of high protein consumption. This investigation confutes the notion, confute means refute. This investigation confutes the notion that trained subjects need only 1.5 to 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight daily, and that intakes above that are superfluous. In fact, we would speculate that the minimal daily needs of dietary protein in trained individuals should be approximately 2 grams per kilogram per day. So the salient points that they're making there are, when a caloric surplus is protein focused, then some very interesting things can happen there. And in this particular case, we saw recomposition. So a simultaneous gain in lean mass and loss in fat mass. And the other point that they made is that protein intake being supposedly ineffective beyond commonly cited figures like 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, that is not necessarily true. And so we will go through more of the protein stuff. But when we talk about fat loss, but recomposition is a really interesting phenomenon because it is driven by relative maintenance caloric intake, but we're looking at a high protein intake and also progressive resistance training, where all the elements kind of come into alignment and then recomp happens. It's in quotes magical, but it's been witnessed in multiple studies now. And I want to point you back to the hierarchy of recomposition capacity, where people who are formerly fit have the greatest capacity to experience recomp, whereas people closer to their potential for muscle gain and fat loss, they have the least potential for recomp. All right, so up here on the screen is a client of mine, an ex-client of mine named Carla, and we did a protein hyperfeed experiment way back in 2009. And so over roughly a 2-month period, we actually witnessed recomposition as a result of just simply cranking her protein up. So she kept her baseline program the same, but instead of having carb up days, we had protein hyperfeed days. So 2 to 3 days a week, she would eat about 2.5 times her normal protein intake. So she was eating about 1 gram per pound normally, but on her protein hyperfeed days, she consumed 2.5 times that. And this was 2 to 3 days a week. And just as a result of doing that, you can see visually, you can see this decrease in the body fat in her midsection there. And indeed, objectively, there was an increase in her chest and shoulder and quad girth, but a decrease in her waist girth. And we just simply implemented the protein hyperfeeding. What's interesting about this particular observation is that it happened about 4 to 5 years before Jose Antonio and colleagues published their protein overfeeding and recomposition results in the peer-reviewed literature. So I'm happy to say I experienced this in the field, and I was very sheepish about reporting it, but seeing it happen and being reported in the peer-reviewed literature gives me a little more confidence to say, yeah, I wasn't totally crazy when I was witnessing this stuff in practice. And with that, we conclude lesson 3. See you in lesson 4, where we talk about individualizing the macronutrient targets for muscle gain.